A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to Novartis. We're obviously thrilled to see that so many people share with us here at Novartis a passion for culture. You've probably figured out that I'm not Margaret. I am Steven Baert. I'm responsible for human resources here at Novartis, and I have the pleasure to give a very brief introduction. Many of you may have followed what's going on here at Novartis, and so there is a very logical link why we chose the topic of culture for tonight. Because we as a company are on a journey. We're on a transformation towards becoming a focused medicines company. But as many of you know, you can have a vision, you can have a great strategy, but it doesn't happen by itself. And what's very interesting when you start to talk to very successful companies and you speak to leaders that have achieved amazing things, they will often tell you that the easy part was to design the strategy with their teams. But that success only happened when they put an organization in place, when they hired a team that had the capabilities, and that the hardest thing they've ever done was to shift the culture. Because if you want to go in a direction, but your organization doesn't want to go with you, there is very little that you will achieve. And on the other hand, I'm sure you've all been part of these moments where the resources are not there and the structure is not there, but for some reason, people just want to make it happen and it magically starts to happen. And that is really the power of culture. Now you can say, nice for you, Stephen, to say that you are in human resources. We would expect human resources to advocate for culture, but it's not just human resources. Studies prove over and over again that culture is the strongest driver to get something done and to ultimately get to better innovation and better performance. And here at Novartis, for us, innovation is what this company is all about. So we need it. So therefore, we are on a culture journey here at Novartis to become a company that is truly curious. We want people who never stop learning, who are hungry to learn new things. People that are not the know-it-alls, but the people that are the learn-it-alls. We want to be inspired because we share this amazing purpose that we should not rest until we find a cure for the diseases that are currently out there. Because honestly, the diseases are our enemy. And so we're inspired by that purpose. But we also want to unboss the organization. And I must admit, we could spend all evening just trying to explain what unboss is all about. That's not why you came tonight. A simple way is empower our people. And we have a very simple way to go about that. We want everybody in this company to know what it's about. We then expect them to apply it. We hope they'll experience it, and we also want to make it sustainable. And in that context, as a curious learning company that we are, we did a lot of research on who's successful, who's really a guru when it comes to culture change. And Margaret is definitely that person. Her TED Talk went viral in this company since we've started to talk about culture. And so when I had a chance to speak to Margaret earlier today, for me it was like meeting an old friend. I don't think for her it was like meeting an old friend, but I feel that I know Margaret quite well. She is a very international person, been born in the US, growing up in the Netherlands, and then working in the UK. But what is very special about Margaret is she's not in human resources, or she's not in organizational dynamics. She is a CEO in the first place. She's an entrepreneur, she's an author, and she has decided to focus on the power of social capital and cultures because she believes truly that it leads to better results. Let's hear it directly from Margaret, and please give her a very warm welcome to Basel. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here in this beautiful building, this beautiful campus. in Basel, where I've spent a lot of time doing some work, I remember with great pride and delight. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to start with a story of an experiment. Some of you may be familiar with it. I keep thinking I can come up with a better one, but I really can't come up with a better one. Stephen cares about culture. The CEO of Novartis cares about culture. Everybody cares about culture, not just because they're cultured, right? But because they recognize that cultures make people more productive. So we're talking productivity. And productivity is a very elusive thing. So scientists the world over, in fact, since 1888 at the Lens Laboratory, which is when the first ever productivity experiment was done, productivity is something we really try to understand. At Purdue University, there was an evolutionary biologist who was equally interested in productivity, but his life was in some ways very much simpler because he worked with chickens. And productivity is super easy to measure when you work with chickens because you just count the eggs. So he designed this very pure, beautiful experiment where he took a whole bunch of very averagely productive chickens and he put them in a flock, put them to one side, letting them do whatever it is chickens do all day for 6 generations. But then he created another flock by choosing individually the most productive chickens. You might call them super chickens, putting them into a super flock. And he put them in a different part of the farmyard for 6 generations. And when he came back, time had passed, the first average flock was more productive than it had ever been. All the birds were very happy, plump, fully feathered, and they were producing more eggs than they ever had before. The super flock was a completely different story. All but 3 were dead. And he concluded that the productivity of the few had been achieved by suppressing the productivity of the rest. Now that's a really interesting idea. And when the scientist came to present his findings to his colleagues, there was a fellow scientist in the audience who jumped up and said, "I know those super chickens, they work in my lab, I can name them." And one reason I think this is such a wonderful story is because I can sense, even from your laughter, you can probably name a few too. You've probably worked with a super chicken or 2 in your lifetime, and you can probably remember their names. Because, of course, what the meaning of this story is that the super flock is, until recently, mostly how we ran organizations. Let's be very honest about this. The people who designed these systems of management were not evolutionary biologists, so they would have understood their Darwin better, right? But they took from Darwin this notion that competition is endemic to living creatures, and if you can increase the competition, you will increase the productivity. And that's really what his chicken experiment was trying to figure out. And it's what we've been banking a lot of organizational design on for a long time. And we've all collectively come to exactly the same conclusion, which is it doesn't work that way. That actually, when you get everybody in an organization fiercely to compete with each other, you get exactly what William Muir found in his superflock, which is that they all peck each other to death. You get a lot of aggression, a lot of dysfunction, and a lot of waste. Now, to take this out of the laboratory, you can see how this is played out in some companies. So one of the kind of formalizations of a belief in this kind of individual competitiveness is forced ranking, where you assess everybody in a company and you put them on a bell curve and you reward the super achievers, the super chickens, and you chuck out 5 to 10% every year at the bottom of the bell curve. And the notion behind this, which was really espoused and evangelized by was that the people at the top will lead the charge and you'll get rid of the slackers. Now, there are a whole bunch of problems with this, and all of the hundreds of companies that followed in their footsteps. And so one of the problems was, of course, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to realize that the safe place in this world is in the big fat middle of the bell curve. Be deeply average, right? Because that's safe. If you're at the top, then you're under a lot of pressure to hold on to your space. And you don't help your colleagues, because if you help them, the person above you might get even higher, and you might get pushed out. So if I have a name or an article or a reference or an idea, and I could help you, I'm going to think twice about it. Because I don't want to fall out of that elite bunch. So I'll probably just keep my idea to myself. I want you to do okay, but not better than me. Okay? The other problem, of course, is you're getting rid of the slackers, which assumes you always have 5 to 10% slackers, which may or may not be true. But actually, the whole system is designed to get rid of the slackers, which is a 5% problem. And nobody's dealing with the 95% problem, which is how do we make the whole system, the whole culture, more productive? So the companies that ran this scheme did so for a long time, and for a long time they were very proud of it. And then they started to notice that something was happening, which is they kept missing really profound opportunities and innovation. Now, one of the companies I know well that ran this way was when I was running tech companies in the United States, invested in one of my businesses, and we worked together, and I got to know them very, very well. And I couldn't help but notice, over a period of 10 years, a whole bunch of really fascinating milestones. So first of all, they missed the internet. That's an amazing thing, right? You're the most important software company in the world, and on the day that it goes public, you have no browser in development. Imagine. You don't have to imagine. That's what happened. Right? So actually, they only really noticed the internet's there when writes a very long, famous memo saying, "Oi, the internet's here, we have to pay attention." Right? When you depend on your CEO to see one of the most monumental innovations in history, something's going wrong with the workforce. Really interesting question as to what. The internet runs on databases. Never developed any really robust database technology. Other big trend in software, games. Came very late to the games market. Next big breakthrough in technology, mobile. Missed mobile. Other fundamental internet technology, search. For years, nowhere in search. For the world's most important software company, this is a staggering string of disasters. At some point, it occurs to them that this forced-ranking competitive culture they've been running isn't delivering for them. Why? Nobody's sharing. I might think search is important. You might think the internet's kind of cool. But nobody's going to speak up because this isn't a safe environment. We're all hunkering in the big fat middle, and we might over lunch be talking about the internet, but we're not going to put our hands up and say anything about it. So finds exactly the same thing. Keeps missing innovation after innovation. And slowly but surely people start to say, you know, this way we have of managing all these super bright people is not getting the best out of them. And one option would have been to say, well, throw them out and get better people. But it's kind of hard to figure out how and where you're going to get better people So that's the moment at which everyone starts to take a step back and say, maybe it's the environment in which they're working. Maybe it's the culture. And I think it's always kind of fun in a place like Novartis to think about culture, because culture in science is the medium in which things grow. That's what it means. So how do we in organizations create a medium in which people will grow? What was happening in all the hundreds of global corporations that were building intensely competitive cultures is that people weren't growing, they were shrinking. They were shrinking their own capacity. They were shrinking their own courage. They were shrinking their own creativity. Now, one of the things that interests me is that at the moment that people started to sense a need for this kind of cultural shift, the rise of digital technologies, especially through mobile and the cloud, became a really insistent drumbeat. And so it became very easy to think, well, we have to change the culture because of the digital revolution. But actually, that's not it. It's a coincidence, and it's an interesting coincidence, but I would argue that even without the digital revolution, you still would have needed to figure out a way of liberating the immense talent that was brought into organizations. And by the way, I'm not only talking about commercial organizations. You could see exactly the same problem in organizations that use forced ranking, in NGOs, in healthcare systems, and in government. The issue was we're spending a huge amount of time, effort, and money to bring in smart people, and then somehow all their capacity is kind of drying up. So what do we do? Now, the digital revolution kind of accelerated that, perhaps. But something else has also happened in the meantime that I think has made this cultural shift more urgent than ever. And this is that there's been a really fundamental change in the environment in which organizations themselves exist. And what I mean is this, which is in the past, the way we used to do business was a kind of very simple three-stage process. We would do forecasts, and then we'd do a plan, and then we'd execute. And as Stephen said, let's not forget execution, okay? And that worked fine for a while because business was pretty stable, markets were pretty stable, technology is pretty stable. But over the last 20 to 30 years, because of pervasive communications and because of globalization, this forecasting piece has become really, really difficult. In fact, the doyen of forecasting argues that these days you can't produce an accurate forecast more than 400 days out. That's really different, right? 5-year plans, forget it, right? The world is changing too fast, and it has become so complex that it's highly unpredictable. So what does that mean? You're a three-legged stool, right? Forecast, plan, execute. Oops, one leg just fell off the stool. How do organizations function if that piece doesn't work, or it doesn't work as reliably as it used to? They only work if you have an organization full of super smart people, all of them antennae, early warning systems, picking up signals, noticing what's happening, and coming into work and saying so. Coming into work and saying, why don't we try this? Or I've just noticed that. Or I think there's an opportunity here today that wasn't there yesterday. You don't need 1 or 2 people doing that. You need the entire workforce doing that. The entire workforce on some level, now part of R&D. Because you don't know where the next breakthrough is going to come from. You don't know where the next challenge is going to come through, any more than we know where the next pandemic will be, or we know where the next banking collapse will be. We know both of them are going to happen. We haven't the faintest idea when, and we don't know where. So we don't even know where to send people to look, which means we need everybody to have their eyes open, their ears open, and be prepared to come in and tell us what they see. And this fundamental shift in the operating environment is why we have seen a move from competition to collaboration. And it's also why we've seen a profound move from heroic soloists, one or two super chickens, to teamwork. Now, teamwork is a lot trickier than it looks. I'm sure everybody in this room has had the experience of working in a team that could get nothing done. I know I have. I remember working on one team that was so dysfunctional, I decided to be sick so that I didn't have to go into work anymore. It just did my head in, right? But I hope you've also had the experience of working in a team where things just flowed, where everybody did better work today than they'd done yesterday, and tomorrow they did better work than they'd ever done in their lives. And you thought, what is that? What's going on? Can I get some of that? So we're all starting to work in teams because we need this huge data collection process, and we need as much intelligence as we can get from everywhere. So we need all those different kinds of people on the team, but how do we get the team actually to work? So they've done experiments into this, some very interesting experiments into what they call collective intelligence. Now, we all understand the wisdom of crowds, right? That groups of people together can make better decisions and see more opportunities than individuals working on their own. So how do you explain the team thing? It used to be we felt that ideal teams had particular casts of characters, but that doesn't seem to be true. So what you wanted to know was, what are the characteristics of really great teams? So they brought in hundreds of people and they tested their IQ. They discovered, which was no surprise really, there's a rough correlation between problem solving and IQ. But then they put people into teams and discovered, as you all know, that some of them were great and some of them were terrible. So then the question is, what defines the great teams? Well, what's really interesting is what doesn't. So the superbly productive teams are not the teams with the highest aggregate IQ. So the idea that you just go out and you get the smartest people you can find and put them all in a team, forget it, it won't work. The great teams also were not the teams with one or two IQ superstars. So again, the idea that, well, we just need a super brilliant leader and then that'll kind of hoist everyone else's capacity to deliver, also not true. And those are things we've believed for a long time. So what is true of the great teams? A couple things. One, they tend to score very highly on a different test, a test called reading the mind and the eye test. It's broadly considered a test for empathy. It's one reason I never use slides when I do talks. I want to look people in the eye. I want to see, are they interested? Are they dozing off? You know, are they engaged? Do I want to spend more time on this or maybe move on because they're getting a bit restless? I also suspect that reading the mind and the eye test may be a surrogate marker for imagination, because empathy and imagination are very closely correlated. The second thing about the really exceptional teams is that when they replayed all the discussions, they realized that the teams got roughly an equal contribution from everybody. So in the discussions, there wasn't a dominant voice, and neither were there any passengers. So you're getting a full contribution from every member of the team. And the third thing they discovered, which I know they weren't particularly looking for, is that the better teams had more women in them. Now, I don't know what that means. They don't know what that means. Is it an element of diversity alone? Is it because, which is quite contentious, do women really think that differently? Or is it something no more complex than the fact that women typically score more highly on the reading the mind and the eye test, so you're doubling down on the empathy quotient? We don't know. But what we do know, which I think is really the nugget in this research, is that what seemed to make a difference wasn't who's on the team, but what's happening between them. Another way of thinking about this is it's the mortar, maybe more than the bricks, that really counts. And indeed, the researchers made this very interesting, provocative suggestion that if it was really the mortar that mattered, it might even not matter what kind of bricks you had, if the mortar was really great. Now, when we come to think about organizational cultures, we're talking about mortar, right? And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that organizational culture isn't just about who do you hire, but what's happening between them. How are they working together? Are they, like the great teams, really listening to each other? Or are they just in their own little mental competitive spaces working in parallel, right? Like 2-year-olds do parallel play and grown-ups collaborate, but a lot of people are still stuck in that parallel play mode, as we know. So maybe the issue is really most important around what is the social relationship between people. Thinking back, how far are these people sharing what they know or the ideas that they have? How generous are they? How much do they trust each other? In competitive environments, there's very low levels of trust. And what's really fascinating is I started kind of piecing this together like a kind of jigsaw puzzle, is I started to think, well, if you're talking about generosity, reciprocity, and trust, then an anthropologist would say, you're talking about social capital. You're talking about the bonds between people. And social capital is an idea that developed when anthropologists used to study communities undergoing periods of extreme stress. And I remember seeing this when I lived in London in the 80s during the recession. I saw what the anthropologists saw, which was in extreme stress, you would have one street that was crime-ridden, full of graffiti and rubbish, and right next to it, you would have a clean, safe street. Same stress, same city, same environment, completely different levels of resilience. And the anthropologists started studying, what's the difference here? And all they could find was that on the clean, safe streets, people knew each other. They looked after each other. They weren't each other's best friends, but they kind of knew, well, who was in and who was out at what times of the day. They had a sense of each other's schedule. If they saw a kid had left a bike out on the street, they'd probably bring it in for safekeeping. They just sort of covered each other's backs. And that alone was enough to deliver radically different levels of resilience. Now, resilience really matters. And it matters in creative enterprises more than anything. And there's a good reason for this, which is if you're going to do something really creative, really innovative, whether it's in science or the arts or manufacturing or marketing or engineering, if you're going to make some kind of fundamental breakthrough, at some point, you are going to be lost and confused to a point you can hardly recognize yourself. Because that's what innovation is. It's going somewhere you've never been before. And when you find yourself, trust me, I've been here, it's not fun. When you find yourself in this moment where you're far away now from what you know to be true, and you're struggling to see where these new insights will get you, what keeps you going is other people. Now, I know this because I've spent a lot of my life working with outstanding artists around the world and outstanding, brilliant technologists around the world. But I also know it because I spend a lot of my time talking to scientists. And I'm really interested in the kinds of creativity and motivation required in a science lab, because I think it's very similar. It's not the same, but it's very similar to the kinds of motivation I've experienced working in technology and working in the arts. And one of the most engaging, interesting scientists that I've talked to on this subject is a fantastic guy named in Israel. And Uri's a very peculiar kind of character. He's very well known now for phenomenal breakthroughs on the kind of boundary between biology and physics. But he hasn't always been well known. And he told me how when he was doing his PhD, he at some point became so confused and lost that he couldn't get out of bed in the morning. And what got him out of bed in the morning were other people in his lab. And he thought about that a lot. And when he came to run his own lab, he thought, well, if my young scientists are going to go through this same excruciating journey that I went through, how can I help them? And he just, he did experiments. That's what scientists do. And he said, okay, we have a weekly lab meeting. Every science lab has a weekly lab meeting. As far as I can tell, they're mostly on Tuesdays, and they're always 2 hours. Some kind of divine mandate, right? But he said the first half hour, nobody's allowed to talk about science. Now, for scientists, this is torture. I know this. I'm married to a scientist, right? He doesn't not want to talk about science. Generally, if you say you're not allowed to talk about science, the whole room goes very quiet. Right? But he persisted, and he said, look, we can talk about sport, politics, movies, cooking, children, anything, but we have to do that for half an hour every week. And what he found was that half an hour every week transformed his lab from a lot of random, ambitious, competitive scientists into people who really knew and liked and cared about each other and helped each other when it got tough. I wouldn't have called it this, but what he was doing in his lab is he was building social capital. Now, I've gone around the world looking at companies that do this kind of as a matter of course. One of my favorites is probably registers more patents than any other company in the world on an annual basis. It's a phenomenally creative environment. And there they have a combination of ways of creating this social capital. One is they have very, very low levels of hierarchy, so there isn't much competitiveness within the organization. Secondly, they hire people and just let them kind of find where are the projects they want to work on. So it's very self-directed, or unbossed, as Stephen would call it. But the other thing they say is, when you have an idea, anybody in the company can call a meeting to talk about it. But here's the deal. Anybody can call a meeting, but nobody has to turn up. So what happens? The people who other people want to help and work with call meetings, and loads of people turn up. Let's hear his idea. Let's see if we can help. And the super chickens find themselves in rooms all by themselves, thinking their idea is brilliant, but unable to execute on it. This quality of helpfulness in a culture sounds really negligible, weak. but it delivers remarkable results. I've done some work with it. Has huge amounts of intelligence, but they're dependent on outstanding teams to make sense of it. And when they look at which teams do really well, what do they discover? They discover they're teams that have worked together for a long time, that spend a lot of time actually not talking about work, building levels of social capital so that when they're really under pressure, because they know they will be under pressure, everybody supports each other to try to understand what on earth is going on here. So this level of collaboration isn't just mandated because of different disciplines. It's mandated because actually otherwise you can't get anything done. And you can't take a bad idea and turn it into a great idea unless everybody wants to make their full contribution to that process. And the bad ideas really count. Because I think, one of the things that everybody here told me when I arrived today is Novartis is very perfectionist. I could have guessed that, to be honest, because almost every scientific organization I've ever worked with is very perfectionist. And it is perfectionist because at the end of the innovation chain, you have to be. You get the manufacturing wrong, and people die. But the problem is, the perfection is at the end of the process. It shouldn't be at the beginning. At the beginning, you need lots of ideas. Ideas are cheap, right? Everybody has ideas all the time. What you need is the really safe environment where people can ask the really stupid questions and say, well, what if we did this? Or what if we did that? Or has anybody considered? All those questions nobody asked for decades, right? All those questions which, surrounded by people that you know and you trust, may turn into kind of interesting ideas. And then they may become actually quite promising ideas. And they may eventually become outstanding ideas whose execution then does have to be perfect. But it isn't perfect at the beginning. High levels of generosity, tolerance for the bad idea that still has a glimmer of something is fundamental to a culture of creativity and innovation and resilience. One of the aspects of innovation is that it is exceptionally difficult to predict. We go right back to this world where prediction has become so hard. Scientific innovation, for example, operates on a spectrum with complete flukes like penicillin or microwave radiation at one end, and totally predictable breakthroughs like the Human Genome Project. Everywhere along that spectrum, there are opportunities. So we don't quite know where the great breakthrough, the great idea is going to come from next. So we need environments that are highly supportive of these very ragged, very inchoate, very raw ideas to see which of them will have the staying power really to turn into something. And recognizing this very unpredictable nature of innovation is what's led us to start thinking about doing it in a very, very different way. So one of the most promising breakthroughs, I think, in the last 10 years has been the development of open innovation platforms. What do you get on open innovation platforms? You get questions and problems posted that anybody in the world can solve. And what's so fascinating about these is that they are routinely solved by people working outside of their domain expertise. So a researcher, for example, looking for a biomarker for Lou Gehrig's disease has the problem solved by a plant biologist. It's not a plant biology problem, but the plant biologist can think about it in a really different way. Woe betide the organization whose culture says, you're a plant biologist, you're not allowed to work on this problem. Right? That's why this social capital really matters, so that people really do listen to and take seriously contributions that may be quite unexpected and unpredicted. What we know about the world as it becomes so unpredictable is that you need ideas and insights from all kinds of people, and you may not have any idea where the breakthrough contribution is going to come from. All you know is that you need a culture which will ensure that the problem and the idea have easy, free, uninhibited ways to meet and connect. If you have people competing with each other and hoarding information, you will never get that. When you have high degrees of social capital, what you get are conversations along the line of, oh, that's what you're working on. I've had an idea, but you're not on my team. Yeah, I know, but I've had an idea. But you're not a medical researcher. No, I know, but just bear me out, right? I've had an idea, and I'm going to give it to you for free because maybe it'll make the difference. That's a culture where innovation becomes very easy, very standard, and actually very fun. Historically, of course, there are precedents for this. Probably the most famous lab in history is the lab that gave us lasers, transistors, the whole digital revolution, and created large numbers of Nobel laureates. How did they do that? Well, it wasn't by picking people. It wasn't by thinking about the bricks. Actually, there's a fantastic piece of research that traces all the breakthrough work down to about 3 guys who, as far as I can tell, spent most of their time in the lunchroom. What were they doing? You know, performance management systems would say they were wasting their time. What were they doing, these guys? They were helping scientists who got stuck. They were saying things like, actually, you've been in the lab 3 nights running with no sleep, go to bed. Or they were saying, go talk to George. He worked this problem a while ago. Maybe he's got some ideas. Or have you read this latest paper? Maybe it'll give you some thoughts. They were kind of network traffic directors, sending ideas and information, problems and information to places where they could meet. These kinds of cultures are like living organisms, where the whole thing only really works if the system is healthy and supporting all of the other parts that everybody requires to make it work. Hierarchy, competition, ruthless evaluation and management, over-predictability impede all of that. This idea of unbossing is a very fascinating idea. And mostly what it's focused on is not just empowering people, but getting the impedance of bosses out of the way. Now, I've been a boss. I know why I'm an impediment sometimes. Because as soon as I had power, people spent their time thinking, when I asked a question, what does Margaret want the answer to be? What's the idea Margaret would like us to say? I don't want people to guess what I'm thinking. I want to hear what they're thinking. Just as I'm sure would have liked to have heard from somebody that the internet was going to be a big deal, right? The point of unbossing is to create a culture in which people feel safe and free to think for themselves. Safe and free to think for themselves. There's a high degree of probability that most people in this room have never been in such a place. We all went to school where we were bright if we got the right answer. We got into better schools if we kept getting the right answer. And we got PhDs if we got the right answer. But now we're in a place where nobody knows the right answer. We have to think for ourselves. Now, one of the organizations I know best that has really perfected this, I think, is an organization in the Netherlands. And I joked with Stephen recently, or earlier today, it's the Netherlands taking over the world. I kind of hope so, to be honest. I really had a wonderful time living in the Netherlands. It strikes me as an excellent idea. At any rate, fantastic organization in the Netherlands, started by an economist, which is rare, right, who was also a nurse, which is super rare. Right? And he'd given up on economics because he found it dreary, and he got into nursing because he wanted to help people. And he discovered that nursing was being done in the Netherlands, as it is in many places, where it had been productized so that every client or patient got, 7 minutes on Monday and 8 minutes on Tuesday and 10 minutes on Wednesday and so on. And every session had a product number against it and a billing code and all the shenanigans and bureaucracy that go with that kind of industrialization of care. And he did that for a couple of years and he hated it. And he went to the Dutch Minister of Health and he said, I have an idea that there's a different way to do this that might be a lot better. Can I get a little bit of funding and political support to do an experiment into different ways of delivering high-quality home care nursing? And they said, yeah, you can have 6 months and you can have a certain amount of money and tell us what you find. So what he did, the guy's name is, brought together a team of 10 nurses and he had 50 patients. And he said, here's the deal. Do the right thing. That's it. That's the job description. That's it. And they said, well, how do we know what the right thing is? He said, well, you're nurses. You should know the right thing. I said, really? I said, yeah. So they did. They worked as a team of 10. They consulted each other a lot. I'm not quite sure what to do with this patient. What do you think that we should do here? And at the end of his experiment, what proved was that, A, this absolutely worked, but more to the point, because it was an experiment, there were things he didn't anticipate. He'd cut the cost of home care nursing by 40%. How? Patients got better 40% faster. It's astounding. Right? It's astounding. That's what happened when he took all the bosses and all the bureaucracy out of the system, trusted qualified individuals to think for themselves and make good judgments. His organization now dominates home care nursing in the Netherlands. They've been invited by the education minister to see if they can redesign education. They're proliferating the healthcare model in Taiwan, in Japan, in some parts of the United States, and in the UK. It's an extraordinary model because everybody feels better about it. The patients are doing better. The nurses feel greater respect and self-respect. And while they have about 10,000 nurses working for them now, they have a back office of 37 people. So the money that the system costs is being spent where people feel it, on the patients and on the nurses. And it's an extraordinary thing. I sometimes bring some of their nurses over to the UK to meet with their British counterparts who work in the National Health Service. And sometimes the British nurses cry because this is how they want to work. This is why they went into healthcare in the first place. They wanted to help people, and they found themselves these little pieces of machinery in this very ornate engine that they didn't understand and that didn't really care about them. And they listen to what is done in the Netherlands, and they think, but that's why I wanted to be a nurse in the first place. I'm always fascinated that in organizations, there are all these huge, long conversations about how do we motivate people? How do we incentivize people? And I think to myself, well, how do you incentivize parents to look after their children? Or their dog? Or their cat? How do you incentivize artists to paint? Or sculptors to sculpt? Or architects to invent weird things that have never been invented before? You don't have to. They are motivated. Great cultures don't motivate people. They take people's motivation and amplify it by the presentation of hard problems, big challenges, resources, and phenomenal colleagues. That's what gets that graph that Stephen showed you. It's not managing people like widgets. It's managing people like people and creating cultures in which it's safe and even fun to think for yourself. I remember when I first started my first software company in the United States. And I'd come from the UK. I'd run a very successful business in the UK, and I ran this business in the US. And I hired phenomenal people. My chief technology officer had received the first email in history. Incredible. I mean, it was like the coolest guy on earth, and he looked like Father Christmas, you know, so what was not to love? So I had him. I had another guy who'd built one of the first ever internet browsers. I had amazing, amazing people. And I remember sitting in my office one day and thinking, it doesn't sound right. It was too quiet. And I know with computers and everything, you know, everybody's kind of got headphones on, you know, typing, and offices have gone deadly quiet these days. But I thought, even so, there's something wrong. And I started just kind of watching what's going on around me. And I thought, everybody's working really hard. That's the problem, right? And I thought, they're all working in their little boxes, and they're not working with each other. They're working in parallel. They didn't know each other. I'd look in the lunchroom, and people would go to the fridge and get out their lunch and sit down and eat it and read, and there'd be somebody sitting right next to them, and they wouldn't be talking to each other. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This has got to change. What would I do in England? I know, we'd go to the pub. But, you know, we're in Massachusetts. Almost all year it's winter. There are no pubs. Everybody drives. It was not an option. So finally, I was desperate. I thought, okay, at 4:30 on Fridays, everybody's going to stop working, and every week, 3 people are going to stand up and tell us who they're here, why they're here, who they are, and what they want most out of life. I cannot describe to you how excruciating this was. Right? The engineers mostly did PowerPoint presentations. The marketing people did comedy, right? Stand-up comedy. But the thing is that over time, because it was excruciating for everybody, it was excruciating for me, it was excruciating for the CFO, it was equal excruciating opportunities. We all kind of got to laugh with each other and to realize that actually, yeah, we were all capable of being embarrassed. We were all capable of being embarrassing. But actually, we supported each other because we all had to go through it. And we started to see each other not as the marketing person or the salesperson or the engineer or the QA person. We started to see each other as people. And as people started to help each other. And I didn't know it at the time, of course, but my intervention had come not a moment too soon. Because we were building some technology that did amazing things. But we hit a snag. And the snag was this, that the more users we got for our technology, the more expensive the technology became. Okay. This is exactly the opposite of a business model. You don't want your costs to go up as your customers go up, because, you know, the parallel lines will never meet, right? And you'll lose money forever. And even very patient venture capitalists sooner or later will say, really, Margaret? I don't think so. Anyway, so I thought, you know, the engineering team talked about it, the IT team talked about it. And finally I said, look, if we can't solve this problem, we have no business. And I cannot take money from investors if I don't think we have some vague chance of solving this problem. So we had a company-wide meeting, and the chief technology officer explained it. Then the head of marketing explained it in words that everybody understood. And then I simply said, there's the problem. That's where we are. We need help. Anybody, just think about the problem, and if you have any ideas, let us know. That was on Friday. I came into the office on Saturday morning. It was a really stressful time. And there was a guy there, I'll never forget. He looked about 12. I'm persuaded he was 22. I hope he was 22. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I've had this idea. I said, what do you mean you've had an idea? He said, I had an idea about how to solve the problem. And he said, I thought I'd just kind of try some stuff and see if it worked. Now, as it happened, it didn't work. But he got close enough that on Monday, when the CTO came in, they had a really interesting conversation. And I could see from the corner of my office, you know, that the CTO's office kept getting more and more people into it till it became like a cartoon. I thought it was going to explode, right? Anyway, cut a long story short, of course, we solved the problem. We solved the problem. And we solved the problem not because we knew who could solve it, and not because we knew how to solve it, but because we shared the problem and said, anybody who can help, come on in. Now, I think this is important because I think when we're working in these very complex environments, we are going to hit these problems over and over and over again. And you see it because you'll see it in newspaper stories where technology goes wrong. Because new technology always goes wrong. And that's how people test it, right? Because the mistakes are learning. And we need environments where it's safe to make mistakes in the understanding that mistakes are how you go from the bad idea to the better idea to the great idea. Things, when you're innovating and creating new products or services, things will always go wrong. It's only when you start to repeat yourself that you can start working on the perfectionism. But when you're doing something new, you're going to make mistakes, and the faster you make them, and the better you understand them, and the less you hide them, and the more you examine them, the more you will learn faster. But that is only ever going to happen in a culture where people feel safe, where they feel trusted, and where they feel that when they offer help, they won't be rebuffed, or when they're given help, that they're not being criticized. One of the absolute characteristics of this new environment in which we're working is that we don't know where the problems are going to come from, and we don't know where the solutions are going to come from. And what that means is that instead of trying to pigeonhole people in highly specific designated roles, we need their expertise, of course, but we need them to bring that expertise to grow in a culture where they can get help and they can ask for help without any kind of fear or judgment. We must aim not just for innovation, but also for legitimacy, to build cultures in which nobody wins unless everybody wins. Thank you very much.